Giving and receiving feedback is a constant and seemingly never-ending problem in D&D. Going back years on forums, you can still find people where they lay out their problem and the very top comment is, "Have you tried talking to them about that?" While I know that this is a human problem rather than a D&D specific problem, there are some strategies that you can take in D&D to mitigate the worst of it. Now, a lot of them start with things that you set up in session 0, but I think that a big thing that is missed is that those things that you set up need to be continually checked in on throughout the life of the campaign. Now, while I'm going to start with describing the session 0 work, the main advice of this video is regarding how do you keep doing that throughout the campaign. But like I said, let's start at session 0 so that we see the groundwork that we need to lay. Have a robust and detailed session 0 is probably one of the most basic pieces of advice that new DMs are given, and for good reason. Session 0 is incredibly important. But there are a ton of other videos that go over good session 0 strategies, so I won't be going into that much detail here. If you're interested, I do recommend Ginny D and Bob the World Builder's videos on the topic, and Bob has a segment in his video that I really want to zoom in on. One of the great things about his in particular is that he develops this document, this checklist for DMs to go down during session 0 that can be very helpful for making sure that everything is covered. And the part I want to zoom in on is table expectations. Have you ever been in an argument with someone and halfway through you realize that you're not even talking about the same thing, or you're totally just off topic from what the argument was actually about? Now you're just arguing about the argument. A lot of times that this sort of situation can come from a disconnect in expectations. You'll hear that a lot with, well, we're just not on the same page, or you caught me off guard. Things like that can really reveal that going into the argument, you guys were already on different wavelengths, to use another colloquialism. Often people are just arguing about what they expected rather than what they actually want or wanted in the first place. You can hear that in phrases like, "I would have been fine with it if you had only told me in the first place," or "if you had only let me know first." These are all core things hitting on a breaking of expectations. And in D&D, those expectations are so important. You're playing a game to have fun, but it's a game that is so freeform that having a disconnect in expectations can wildly throw you off the tracks. Think about something like basketball. It has very strict rules. There's no layer of role playing, so the expectations going into a game are very straightforward. You know very much what to expect going into a game of basketball, but you can still have your expectations broken. You'll hear a lot of time with people talking about rec leagues of, oh, that person is taking it too seriously, or they're trying too hard. You hear that a lot in video games. Oh, they're tryharding, they're sweating. This is a difference in expectations. This is a difference in what people were expecting to get out of the game. And those are games with predefined rules, predefined lore. All of that is already agreed before you even go in. In an activity as freeform and fluid as D&D, these expectations are a top priority before you even begin playing. Now that's why I want to highlight Bob's table expectations section, because I think it asks great questions for making sure that players are aligned going into session 0 and then into session 1. But what if your expectations change? What if you are asked a question during session 0 like, hey, are you okay with violence and gore? And you as the player think, yeah, I'm okay with that. Like, I play violent video games, I'm fine with violence in movies, no problem with violence and gore in D&D. But then 5 sessions in, 6 sessions in, you start to get a little uncomfortable with maybe how one player in particular is describing the violence and gore. Or maybe even the DM himself, or herself. Maybe there is a disconnect in what you thought violence and gore even meant at the very beginning. And this can also be reversed. Maybe there was a topic that you were worried about broaching during the game that once you've gotten into it, you've seen how the other players are handling their RP. Maybe you decide that it's a topic that you'd actually be okay exploring. This is really common with sexual content. I know a lot of people aren't okay with that in their games, but sometimes if you get more comfortable with the players that you're playing with, some of that can be okay to maybe explore a little bit. Now, these sorts of change in expectations happen a lot, but there's no common practice for how to address them. Most of the time, you have to call a whole separate meeting and, go into it, or maybe just have a side conversation with some of the players that then works its way over to the DM. A lot can get lost in translation, and a lot of times emotions end up heightening because people feel like you were having a bad time for so long, or maybe that you've been talking about things behind their back. This can cause really big rifts at the table. And that's where we get to the main advice of this video: check-ins. It's a simple name for a simple concept, but it's something that's been pretty missing from most of the tables that I've both run and played at until very recently. See, I'm currently in a game with a first-time DM. And after each game, he was pulling aside me and another one of the players, who is also a longtime DM, to ask us for some advice and ask us how we thought the session went afterwards. Now, that eventually evolved into pulling in the other players as well, and eventually we ended up having a check-in after every single session, where we all kind of go around and talk about the pain points, what we did or didn't like. If there was something specifically that the DM was worried about, he can ask us for our feedback. It does, potentially break the immersion a little bit, but it's not like the DM has a checklist that he's going down. It's more of a round table where we just discuss what we did or didn't like throughout the session. Now, does this make taking criticism any easier? That's how I started off the video, talking about feedback. Well, I personally think that it does. Framing this as the time and space to bring up critiques or pain points really takes the pressure off both the player and DM who are doing it. Remember earlier when I was talking about it, normally you have to call a whole separate meeting, or you have to reach out separately to the DM. That can add a layer of magnitude to that request, especially if you're not fully comfortable with everyone in the call. Maybe some of them are good friends, but some of them are acquaintances. And having this designated time, this designated roundtable, makes it feel much more casual and makes it feel much more productive, like you're all working together to go over what was good and what was bad about the session. And that's another thing. When you're bringing up bad things, most often it's sandwiched in between things that you did like. Also, because it is directly after the session, at least that's when we do ours, everything is still very fresh in people's minds. It's not just, oh, I didn't like that session. It is, I did not like this part of this section of the session. I didn't like that NPC's voice. Rather than, 2 weeks later, you might forget and you might just think, I just don't really like the way that the DM played the NPCs. One of those is much more productive. The DM can work on the character voices because you could deliver that fresh feedback. Whereas one is like, well, I just don't like the way that you do NPCs. It's much more emotionally charged. It seems much more personal. This is also the perfect time to bring up any changes you would like to see. Maybe you want to introduce homebrew. Maybe you want to take out some homebrew that was initially introduced. Maybe you want to change something where it matches how your expectations have changed. This is absolutely the perfect time to do this. Like I said earlier, calling a whole separate meeting for all of this can have such an air of magnitude to it, where it feels like things have gotten so bad that you just had to call a meeting because it's not this scheduled out time. And I think that that's the main thing to hit on there. Having a small, sectioned off time to air out grievances, talk about things you liked or didn't like, just takes the pressure off of everyone. It makes it not such a big deal. It's just something that you all do after each session. And wrapping back to session 0 expectations, this is how you maintain them. By having these small segments where people are expecting to talk about the structure and feel of the session and of the campaign as a whole, it makes them much more willing to listen to any changes in expectations that you might have. And there it is again, the expectation that they are willing to listen to your expectations. Expectationception. Exception. Exception? Dumb jokes aside, there are some other side benefits as well. Something that I've really noticed with this is that the DM feels much more comfortable making in-the-moment rulings without feeling like he has to overly justify them. Because he knows that there is a small segment at the end of the session where everyone will bring up any grievances that they had or any problems that they had with any ruling. And from the flip side of that, if you're a player and the DM makes a ruling that you don't like, you know that there's an area at the end where he will be ready to listen to critique. He will be expecting critique in that moment. And so it makes it much easier to brush past it during the session because you know you'll be able to talk to him about it later. To be clear, this won't magically solve disagreements, but I do think that it really tempers emotions when talking about them. It's like having a sealed container that's slowly building up with pressure. It's much better to occasionally open the container and relieve the pressure, even if maybe you didn't need to open it that week, rather than just let it stay closed and build up until finally you need to open it, and the result is explosive. Now, DMs, for this to work, you do have to put your pride aside a bit. If there's something that you feel like you nailed, but then a player comes to you with critique, you just have to hold that. Now, from the other side of that, players try to be as specific as possible with your feedback. That's one of the great strengths of these check-ins, is that they happen so quickly after assumingly the issue that they should still be very fresh in your mind. Like I talked about with the NPC earlier. I didn't like that NPC's voice, rather than I don't like the way that you talk when you're doing NPCs. Those are very, very different. One is very specific, one is more general. The more specific you are, the less emotionally charged it becomes. It gives the DM something that they can directly work on. They can directly work on modulating their voice differently while they're doing NPCs, rather than having to start from the whole ground up on like, well, is it, the type of NPCs I create? Is it the way I play them? Is it my personality? That's so broad and vague that it's really hard for them to hone in on something, and it makes it just feel like you don't like them. Same thing if you had a problem with combat, rather than just saying, I didn't really like the combat this time. Try to say like, I didn't like the combat because it felt flat. It didn't feel like there were enough terrain hazards for my liking. Now the DM might have reasoning behind that, and you can go through and discuss that, but like I said, the more specific, the better. In conclusion, I think that setting up clear expectations in session 0 is so important, but checking in to make sure that those expectations are maintained is as important, if not more important, for the health of your game. Setting it up as a norm takes so much pressure off and makes those hard conversations just a bit easier. It can be the difference between a years-long game that players will remember for the rest of their lives and an RPG horror story.